Okay, we are going to be creating the sphere that we will eventually cut out. So we're going to go ahead and use this as practice, and we're going to do the background and the table with the shadow as well. But we're going to wind up cutting out this sphere in the end, and then we're going to place it here. But it'll be good practice for us to create a background and to create these different shades of this. This will go onto our ribbons piece here. What we're going to need is a small piece of paper and then a scrap paper to go underneath it. You can just use computer paper. I'm using gray so that you can see mine. We will take a tape roll because that's the size that we used with the other one, and we're going to make it go off to the side and about right here. We're not going to center it. That will allow us to have room for a shadow and a little bit of room for a table. So we know that when creating a table, we just pick a spot behind the sphere, and we're just going to draw a line that is going here. There are pros and cons to acrylics. One of the cons is that it dries quickly, but one of the pros is that it dries quickly. It allows you to layer on top of it. So if you mess up, it's okay. You can just paint right on top of that. It does make blending a little bit more difficult, but you'll see very quickly that you can blend quite nicely. Now, you can try to make it as smooth as you want. However, we find as artists become more and more professional, they like to leave their brush strokes in there. They like to add that texture to the sphere. So it's okay if it's quite a bit textured, but it's also okay if you try to make it smooth. It's up to you. We're going to be starting with the background, and we're going to just be using red, yellow, and blue. Now, when you take Painting 2 with me, I will correct that there is there's not three primary colors. In elementary and today, we're going to pretend that there's only three primary colors, and that's one yellow, one red, one blue. But in reality, we have warm reds and we have cool reds. We have warm blues and we have cool blues, and we have warm yellows and cool yellows. I don't put black on my palette almost ever. Very rarely do you need to have black. Black is a poor way of making things darker. That is not a good way of making things just darker.
What is it supposed to be like?
The way to make things darker is to use a darker shade of whatever you're using in that color. So if I'm wanting a darker red, I will add blue to that red to make it darker. So we're going to see that done in just a second. We have 2 medium paintbrushes, and we have a water container, and we have a palette knife. So with our palette knife, it keeps us from getting 2 colors on our brush. When you mix with your brush, not only does it mess up the bristles, but it also has 2 colors that get into your bristles, and that means that you're not going to have a nice smooth color. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a good amount of my red, and I'm going to spread it out on my palette. And that allows this red to stay pure red, but I'm going to be mixing over here. I'm just going to take a little bit of blue. It doesn't take much. And I'm going to start on one side of that spread out red. It's going to take a little bit more blue than I thought. And that's going to turn this into a very, very dark purple. And if you add enough blue, it'll turn it to nearly black. If you wanted an even blacker color, you could add just a little bit of yellow, and that would make it even a darker color that turns almost brown. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be starting with red, and then we're going to be working our way to a darker and darker red as we work our way up. And that's going to add this nice effect to the background. We're going to be starting with the background, working our way around the sphere. So I'm going to load my brush with pure red. I'm going to create that line around my sphere, working on controlling my brush, making sure that I'm not going inside that sphere. If you do slightly, it'll be okay. We'll just paint over it in a little bit. But every time I get more paint, I'm going to dip further and further down this mixed color where it's getting darker. So you can see that I'm going pretty high up here with just straight red, but then as I get darker, I'm going to work back down on top of that so that it blends in more nicely. I can also create texture in the background by creating these X marks. Every time I go down, or every time I'm getting more paint, I'm going further down this darker side. I'm going to work my way around this sphere, and then I'm going to start creating X marks again. so that I have texture in my background. As I get further up, I want to make sure to keep coming back down and blending that in. This shouldn't take too long. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on our background. It's okay that I'm going off my page because I have my paper underneath it. I'm going very quickly, but I want you to go semi-quickly as well. Then in the corners, I'm going to make it just completely dark. When using a palette knife, I turn it at a slight angle, I scrape to the middle, and then you press down, and then you scrape back the other side. If you're only using the very tip to kind of stir like this, and that's the only part that's touching, you're not stirring very much. But if you'll use the flat part, pull it out, and then scrape it back to the middle. Pull it out, and then scrape back to the middle. That will mix it the best. So I'm kind of rocking my palette knife back and forth. Once you're done with your palette knife, it could be dry. You can just wipe it off with a paper towel, and that should clean it just fine. So we're gonna be creating the gray that goes on the table. And if you've ever had to paint gray on a wall in your house, you go to the paint store and you notice that there's a lot of different grays. There's cool grays, warm grays, all different kinds of grays, and that's why the traditional way of adding black and white to make gray is a boring way of doing it. You can see here I've added yellow and blue and white to create a turquoise, and then I add a little bit of red to turn it into this color. If you wanted it to be a little bit more gray, we could add some more blue, and that'll make it slightly more gray. You could always add more white, and that's giving me this color here. It's kind of more of a turquoise gray color. If I wanted to wipe off my palette knife, if we wanted to use a base of red, a little bit of blue, we could turn that into a gray by adding white. And you can see this is the color that we get just right off without adding any yellow. But if we add just a smidget of yellow, it'll turn it more gray. And so we have more of a pinkish gray here. And you could turn that any direction you wanted. You could add a little bit more blue to make more of a bluish gray. So if I was to take this blue here and add a little bit more white, you can see the variety of grays that I can get not using black. And so this is closer to a traditional gray that we see. You choose a gray. It could be any kind of gray that you want, but we're going to be creating our table that is down here. I'm going pretty quickly, but take your time so that you can stay outside that circle, work on your brush techniques and having control of your brush, and try to stay around that circle that we're going to turn into a sphere. You want to kind of hide your brush strokes, so I'm going to be creating some X marks within this table, maybe even some A shapes and some V shapes to hint at that it being possibly some drapery. And there we go. I've got a background and a table here in the foreground. Wash your brush, but don't leave it in the water. We'll wash it, and then we will wipe it off using our paper towel. Also use your paper towel to wipe off your palette knife. It should clean really easily. And then we will wait to do the next step. Next thing we're gonna be creating is the sphere. And so you see this yellow highlight here, but we're actually not creating that yet. We're gonna let the acrylic paint dry, and then we're going to layer on top of that. That's one of the pros of acrylic paint. What we're gonna be doing is we're gonna be doing the opposite of what we did on the background. So we're gonna take red, and we're going to spread it out again. But this time, instead of making it darker using blue, we're gonna make it lighter using white. So I'm gonna take what remaining amounts of white we have left, and we're going to make it a little bit lighter here, but be careful to mix it into all of the red. I want to take some white, and I want it to get very white. And so I have red, I have a lighter red, and then I have this very, very light pink, and then I still have a little bit of just white here. So I'm going to take that just white, and I'm going to fix my mistakes right here where I overlapped in my sphere. And then I'm going to take my lightest red, my pink, and I'm going to blend that in. And then I'm going to mix down to my next darkest. And for the sphere, right now I'm going straight across, but what I really want to be doing is I want to have it make a moon shape or a C shape that creates, here, let me make it very obvious. It's going to create a shape that looks like this. Because the sphere is round, and so we want it to blend in this direction. So I'm going to pull it up a little higher on the edges and let it blend off into that light pink white color. I'm going to have to go back. I got too much of that dark red. I'm going to have to pull it back a little bit. But I want it to get whiter and whiter very quickly until it's almost pure white up here at the highlight. And then it's going to slightly get darker and darker using that C shape. And then the goal is to get back down to a pure red at the bottom. Your sphere is a circle like this, and the paint, the highlight comes like this. So when you're blending in this direction so that it gets darker here. And then it gets lighter coming up and then lighter. Yes. So the next step is to add this yellow highlight. And the way I did this was to dry brush it in. So I took some yellow and then I took white and I made it pretty white. So I took quite a bit of white there and mixed it into the yellow. And then I took my paintbrush and I wiped it off on a paper towel. And then I brushed it onto the dry acrylic. And that leaves a yellow glazing that glazes on top of this, or at least the effect of it. And that kind of makes it look like the highlight. The sun is hitting a nice warm point of this. And I just brush it out best I can, try to make it nice and smooth. That's pretty hard to see on the screen while it's wet. It's got a little bit of a shine. But you can see I've done it on this one, and on this one I went very white right here, so it really highlights. You can also notice that I made it a little bit darker on the bottom side of my spheres. The way I did that was I took red and I added the blue to it, just like we did on the background. You might even have that still, where we have some red with some blue to it. And I do the same thing. I make this purple color, and then I wipe it off on my paper towel, and I brush that into the bottom side of this, making sure to keep it at that C shape so that it looks like a sphere. And then I'm just going to brush it out. Really trying to stretch that color out, blending it in. And then we're done with our sphere. The next step will be the shadow. And we want to have a dark shadow. And like I said, I don't use black. And so we're going to start with those colors that we know are dark, which is the red and blue. And we're just going to go pure red and pure blue with equal amounts, half red, half blue. That makes a very dark color. To make it more gray, we add just a little bit of yellow. And we're going to take that and we're going to create our shadow with that. It goes slightly underneath on this side, but then it really is going to pull out on this side over here. And I want it to be really dark up against the sphere, but then slightly getting lighter as it goes out. So I'm just going to add just a tiny bit of white to my brush, or a little bit of that gray that we have left over, and I will mix that in as it gets further out. I didn't allow it to be dark enough here at the front, so I'm going to come back to my dark, and I'm going to add that to my shadow. And there we go, we've got a shadow. We'll let this dry at our table. Once we're done with this step, we'll clean our paint brushes and we'll clean our paint palettes in the sink. When you're cleaning your paint palettes is typically the time that everyone gets paint on their clothes. Put it all the way down the bottom of the sink. Don't let it splatter on you. Take a step back. Don't lean up against the sink, because when you lean up on the sink, it's probably wet with wet paint right there on the counter where other people have been washing. So don't lean on it. Be cautious of it. Take your time. Only one person at a sink at a time. We don't want to have a mess or a chaos. We want to make sure that's controlled. We have plenty of time. Now, if you have all this extra paint, if you have globs of paint on your palette still, we don't want to wash that down the sink. What we're going to do is we're going to scrape it all off, and I actually have some canvases that are set out that you're going to play around with these colors and painting. Sometimes we'll scrape this in the trash can, but this time we're going to scrape it off onto a canvas, and you're going to get to mix those colors and play with those colors and create an abstract collaborative piece with the rest of the class. Okay, so once you're done, take your time cleaning it off. Don't get it on your clothes. This paint does not come out of clothes, so take time, don't splatter on yourself, and we'll finish this up.